Talk about it.
which I take no credit for. As you all have heard before, I'm a bug man, not a farmer. I plant crops. I forget about crops, and I hope other people make them grow for me so that the bugs come in. This here is a beautiful looking soybean field of Plenish beans. These are right between R2 and R3. And this is the time when we need to start thinking about getting back into bean fields to start sweeping them for pod pests. Right now, our earworm flight is just starting to roll in from the south. I've got a few here, a few of my volunteers. We stole a whole bunch of moths out of these traps earlier today for insecticide testing. So there's not as many in here. There we go. There's a few. Yeah, they're cute. They're nice. They're the typical MBM, medium brown moth. Especially in sweet corn. So as you all know, I cover both field crops and vegetable crops. So if you have any questions about earworm control in vegetables, you can see me later. But in soybeans, typically the crop stage that is at the greatest risk for earworm is when the beans are flowering in full flower, when our big moth flight begins. That's typically going to be your barley or your wheat double crop beans. And last many years, it has been, earworms have been a problem, Route 9 south, and once you get Route 9 north, they start petering out. I don't know why, but we get fewer and fewer in soybeans once we get past Georgetown out to Bridgeville. I've got a crew that has been busy pinning insect samples in the lab the last few days. We'll pass these out. Soybeans are host for more than 500 different insect species. Very few of them actually cause problems. Looking at this field, I see a little bit of feeding from bean leaf beetle. I see a little bit of feeding from what could be Japanese beetle or Asiatic garden beetle. And there's probably a little bit of feeding from green cloverworm, but this is minor. This is hardly anything. Soybeans can take a real beating in terms of defoliation. Our thresholds are very conservative. Once the beans are in the reproductive stages, our thresholds are closer to 20-25% defoliation. These beans probably could lose even more than that and not lose yield. So I don't worry too much about this. It's flashy, it's eye candy, but it's not usually consequential. We do have stink bugs. Stink bugs are more of an issue on our full season beans. A little bit less so on the double crop, but they will blow into double crop beans. We've got blacklight traps scattered all across the state. We've got 10 sites that have blacklight traps on them, mostly for earworms, but we also record stink bugs in those blacklights. We have a trap in Greenwood that has been consistently catching a high number of green stink bugs all season long. It's the only trap. So whereas most of our traps are catching 15, 20 stink bugs over 3 nights, the Greenwood trap has been catching between 1 and 200 stink bugs in that same time period. So if you have soybeans up in the Greenwood area, this is a great time to sweep them. We started last week doing a stink bug survey across the state, looking for R3 to R5 beans, stopping every few miles on east-west roads, and just hitting fields and doing a quick survey. The fields that we stopped in the Greenwood area were loaded with stink bugs, several times over threshold. Our threshold is 5 stink bugs and 15 sweeps. That field probably had closer to 12 to 15 and 15 sweeps. It was glorious infestation. So I dropped a spray trial on top of them. Green stink bugs are fairly easy to kill with most pyrethroids. If you have a lot of browns or brown marmoratids, bifenthrin is the material of choice. You also need to take into effect where you're sampling. So if I want to know if a soybean field is going to have stink bugs, I usually go right along the tree line and start my sweeping there. If I wanted to know if that field needs to be treated, I go about 200 feet, 300 feet away from the tree line and start sweeping. Stink bugs are an edge species. Brown stink bugs, you may pick up a few more of them if you're closer to corn. Green stink bugs, you're going to pick them up if you're closer to deciduous trees, particularly wild cherry. They drop their first generation in wild cherry. Brown stink bugs drop a generation in small grains and corn. Other soybean pests to keep an eye out. This is deck disease damage. Deck disease stem borer will lay its eggs in the leaf petioles, and when the larvae go into the main stem, often, but not always, it'll cause this petiole to break and die. And so you get this flagged petiole on an otherwise healthy plant. That's a calling card that says that stem has a deck disease in it. I don't make any recommendations for spraying for deck disease. We can kill them, but they come out over a long period of time. Damage does not necessarily relate to stem infestation. I've been in fields where every single infested stem went down, and I've been in other fields where every stem was infested, and the farmer said, yeah, those beans, they yielded great. I got 60 bushels off my double crop beans. I won't make a recommendation to spray $18 worth of insecticide when there's nothing else to hit. And that's usually right around the second week of July. That's when deck disease populations tend to peak, but they'll stay active all the way through August. Other soybean pests. We've got deck disease, we've got stink bugs. Earworms. Mentioned that these things are going to be more of an issue on our double crop. So start paying attention to those, particularly after all this weather comes through and probably drags up a whole bunch of malls from farther south. North Carolina and Virginia right now are reporting very high earworm counts in their soybeans. They're already spraying soybeans for earworm. What they'll do here is pretty much anyone's guess, but be searching for that. In the weekly crop update, I will start including links to a very handy soybean earworm threshold calculator. You can put in your control cost, your number of worms in a sweep sample, and the value of the beans, and kind of get an idea of what a good ballpark is for managing earworm. One thing that threshold does not take into consideration is if you have to drive over soybeans versus not driving over soybeans. You are going to lose some yield potential if you have to drive over and crush beans. So keep that in mind too. That's going to really change whether or not a field is worth treating for earworm. A couple weeks ago, switching gears away from earworm, a couple weeks ago I was getting calls on spider mites in soybeans. Anyone here have had to deal with them this year? Spider mites, not spiders. I can't help you with spiders. So spider mites and soybeans, there were some fields that I would have made a treatment recommendation on until we got 8 inches of rain. This here is a soybean leaf that's heavily stippled from mites. But if you have really sharp eyes and you look on the underside of those leaflets, all those mites are dead. You got small brown puffballs. The biggest mite killers are pathogens, are fungal pathogens. In soybeans and in field corn, when those fungal pathogens start getting going with wet weather, they can burn through spider mites very quickly. In vegetables, we put out enough chlorothalonil and other fungicides that they're very hard to dislodge once they get going. I was in a field out near, it was east of Milton. Every leaflet had heavy stippling on it, but the new growth was fine. We got 8 inches of rain, and then we had 4 days where we got 3.5 inches of rain total, and my population has dropped quickly. It's still worth looking at, but typically I don't see spider mites cause issues once we move into August. The dew points come up. We get morning fogs, and spider mites become much less of an issue. This field here is planted on 30-inch rows. The farm has been very gracious in cultivating it for me, because like I said, I plant things and I leave them. I forget about them. These are Plenish soybeans. Plenish soybeans command a little bit higher of a price point than conventional soybeans, and that's going to change our economic threshold considerations, both with earworms and also with stink bugs. Quality is a little bit more important in Plenish soybeans. Stink bugs are more of a quality pest than anything else. If you're also growing soybeans for seed production, you're going to want to use a much lower threshold than the typical 5 stink bugs and 15 sweeps. You're going to be looking at a 2 stink bug and 15 sweep threshold. Plenish soybeans are probably 3.5 to 4, if I had to guess. Now, a few years ago, last thing on the table here, a few years ago, Virginia Tech put together a insect pest and beneficial guide for corn, soybean, and small grain. I have a handful of these left. Would anyone like them? I see a head shaking over there, and I see... Okay, all right, so we'll divide these up into thirds. Let's see, 1, 2, 3. Yeah, all right. Y'all can fight over these. I apologize.
You can still get these, though, can't you, David? They did have a pretty good supply, I think.
They did have a good supply. It's in the basement of the Tidewater A-Rack.
Okay.
So I don't know how valid the supply is. Let's see. Speaking of beneficials, y'all can pass this out too. These are beneficials. They're not as fun as the pests. Are y'all done with the pests over there? Yeah, I'll just hand those out to one of the other wagons.
I got you. Good.
Thanks. Does anyone have questions on insect management for soybeans? I've got a great crew this year. My right-hand man is Ben Sammarco. And then I've got a whole slew of high school students and undergraduates. Morgan Lowe, Violet Blackham, Victoria Smith, Irene Ernest, Jace Hudson, and Dick Monaco, who checks all of our pheromone traps on a regular basis. So I really appreciate all the help and all the work that they've put in for me this season. So I want to make sure I mention that. Also, sorghum. Alyssa talked a little bit about sorghum and her student projects. Does anyone here grow sorghum? For sorghum, we've got 2 insects that we kind of need to keep an eye on, earworms and sugarcane aphids. Earworms, that's going to be about a week after pollen shed. The moths are attracted to pollinating sorghum, and they'll lay eggs on those panicles, but there's also a lot of mortality with those early instars. Once we get about a week and a half after pollen shed, then we start getting into some larger worms, and we need to start keeping an eye on earworms and sorghum. Also, I found my first sugarcane aphids of the season in Alyssa's sorghum. And they've been rubbed off because I've been carrying this leaf from the sorghum over yonder. If you look in sorghum right now, particularly sorghum that is not headed out yet, you will see cornleaf aphids. Cornleaf aphids look cute in sorghum. They look awful, and then they disappear. I consider cornleaf aphids to be beneficial in sorghum because it jumpstarts a lot of natural enemies. You get a lot of ladybug activity, you get a lot of syrphid flies, and you get a lot of parasitic wasps. Sugarcane aphids reproduce really quickly, and this is the time that they start establishing colonies. It's been about 4 years since I've seen a major problem with sugarcane aphids in sorghum, but they are something to keep an eye on, particularly as we go into the soft dough and the milk stages for sorghum. And I will include threshold recommendations in the weekly crop update for sorghum. Does anyone else have questions? Insect pests. Last thing, which I will not talk about to any extent today because I think my time is about up. We are heavily involved with slug research with a multi-state working group from Ohio, Oregon, Pennsylvania, Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee, and Maryland. Dr. Michael Crossley up on main campus has been leading an effort to identify slug natural enemies. We are looking at slug population scouting and their relationship to damaged plants and how well those damaged plants recover during the season. None of that work is here on the research farm. For the same reason why we've got pretty soybeans behind me, our farm manager cultivates a lot. Slugs here on the farm are very cute and very few and far between. Most of my slug work is done in Kent and Newcastle County. I've got a few fields scattered about Sussex. And honestly, that was a couple of moons ago, and I have since forgotten a lot of the observations that we were making in the early season. I'll revisit them in my notes in October. So if y'all come out to Ag Week, I'll have slug information for you, which will be more timely because who cares about slugs now? We've got pretty beans. So I appreciate all of y'all's attention, and don't let me hold you any longer for dinner.